Okay, welcome to this lecture video on sort of a recap of what we've learned so far. Um, there will be no interaction with anyone else. Like a few people showed up, so I just, sent them on their way. So I'll just be doing a lecture video. So if you're looking for interaction, there will be none. It's just strictly me lecturing, um, trying to make it fun, engaging, and am splitting it into two different parts. So this is sort of a first half. I'm going to be covering Reformation, the Dutch, sort of New Spain. I'm going to stop it there, and then the next lecture video that I will have, I'll probably have that out on Tuesday. We'll be covering Enlightenment and Revolution. Again, have any questions or anything, please feel free to email me. I'll be more than happy to help, answer, or further explain anything that you find confusing within this. Again, this is a recap, so I will be going pretty fast and not covering everything. I'm going to be hitting main points, try to have some connecting ideas. That is my goal. But all right, right. So the first thing, European Reformation, right? Let me find a good. Okay, there we go. Is European Reformation. I wanted to include the meme. I thought it was funny, so that's why I had to move my camera real quick. Okay, so the first point, really is when we start with this Reformation, it's sort of this opposition to Catholicism through new ways of thinking, right? We see Erasmus. He's beginning to start these ideas of Reformation, challenging this notion of Catholicism through his works and through a bunch of other things. Um, and then that influences other people to start challenging and coming up with new views and ideas and questioning whether Catholicism is really truly something they should be believing in. It exposes sort of the papacy and the church and the everything that's wrong with it, right? And it's like, oh, we're the right way to believe in. That's the whole idea of Reformation. You're reforming, right? You're having this new progress in this idea of thinking and sort of believing and belief and all that. And so we see Luther come through. Again, he was a peasant, right? But then experienced social mobility through his father, started getting educated, was a lawyer. Then he started becoming a theologian, right? Started questioning the idea of Catholicism, wanted to challenge these beliefs. And then what he sent the 95 theses in Latin to the was a cardinal or a bishop, and was like, here's my challenges to this religion. um but then of course that got leaked, translated to German, starts spreading like wildfire, crazy. Everyone was like, hey, whoa, wait a minute, hold up, this is actually pretty good, right? I kind of believe what this is. So we start seeing this movement, we start seeing how this new idea is spreading, right? The printing press, right? People are getting access to more books because it's more widely available due to the printing press. The printing press is expanding this information overload, right? I also include media, right? Media is considered text, books, things like that. Widespread education. People start becoming more literate, and in Germany was like a large percentage of the world population started getting more knowledgeable, more educated, more literate. People are reading more. People are able to understand Luther's ideas, understanding like, whoa, hold up, something ain't right here, right? So it's like, let me start challenging this and let me start believing these new beliefs. Let me start putting in opposition to this. And we see that also with Calvin. Um, he's rejecting the church's ideas because he sees the hypocrisy within it. His father was wrongly tried for theft. He disliked the church, wanted true beliefs. Again, going on this idea of this new ideology, a new way of thinking. Again, education, media, things like that help expand this knowledge to the population, to everyone. Also, Calvinism got big in France, right? You have the Huguenots. There. You start seeing these sort of cells break out in all throughout, Western Europe, and that starts wars, religious wars, people questioning what is the true belief, and we start getting all these different things. And this question over here, how were reformers perceived in Europe, right? So like this idea of heretics, they were executed, they were persecuted, they were, get them out of here. We don't want them. We don't want people testing or protesting against, protesting against our found belief of Catholicism, right? You have all these cells breaking out. We must put it into this. But was Luther persecuted? No, right? Again, you have the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, and then you have all these other people who like talked to him, questioned him, and was like, "Are you like, what are you? Let me understand your position." And you start seeing sort of peaceful interactions between religions for a little bit. And like these different cells, which we can later talk more about. Well, I'll get more in detail about that toleration offense. Of course, Luther was not executed, put on house arrest, but other heretics were persecuted. We see a lot of other places start persecuting. We see, James II in England during the 17th century, he starts persecuting a bunch of these people. But then we also see people who don't persecute or are tolerant, right? Richelieu in France, the prime minister, he's tolerant, right? I'll talk more about him later. So that's going to like what happened to Calvinists, especially in France, right? So Calvinist, this ideology started the wars, right? We had these religious wars, started, and so like there was toleration. There wasn't toleration. It was like who's being tolerant, who's not. I'll get more into that. But then think about, these are questions you need to start thinking about. All right, Reformation, what's going on? Persecution. Is there toleration? Is there not toleration? But also, where do these thinkings come from, and what happens after? What is this thinking potentially can arise, like lead to? And what I mean by that is, when I think about Reformation, I kind of think about sort of the start to Enlightenment thinking. Enlightenment thinking happens, they happen simultaneously, we can see. And so I would say one influences the other, and the other can influence the other as well. So Enlightenment influences Reformation, Reformation influences Enlightenment. You get this newfound understanding of scientific thinking, this new understanding of what should be perceived and what shouldn't. How can we perceive all these different things with this newfound ideologies? That influences Reformation. People start challenging Catholicism. This challenging Catholicism could then be like, oh, let's challenge a bunch of other ideas that's been around, right? Again, there's this sort of equilibrium between the two ideas, right? So there's a connection, right, between one another. So that's one major thing to keep in mind. I won't be talking about Enlightenment too much in detail in this presentation. I'll focus that more on the next one. But that's something you start thinking about. Okay, when we think about Reformation, think about Enlightenment, you think about the connection, new ideas coming, challenges. You're challenging the social norm. There's my sociological perspective coming in a little bit, but again, this Catholicism was a social norm. It's being challenged. Why, right? You can get into a bunch of other ideas if you want to go down that road, but then you can, start thinking about this challenge and this conflict. As Marx would say, sort of a conflict theory, right? But in this instance, it's between religions and not classes. Whole nother story. Okay. All right, now Reformation's continued, but this time in a world perspective. We talked about Sikhism, right? This new fusion of Hinduism and Islam. You can look at your notes for like specifics on that. I don't really want to focus too much on the detail, just the main idea. You had these Islamic overlords in, India and down that region, and then they were tolerant to some Sikhism, like some Sikhs, because they saw them as people of the book, right? Because they're, oh, we can relate with you, kind of. We kind of agree with you. Okay, we'll be tolerant. But to others who thought they were sort of polytheistic or believed in multiple religions, they were like, nah, maybe you're not, maybe, and we start getting this notion again of toleration, right? Who's being tolerant, who's not being tolerant, and who's opposing these sort of like religions at the top and who aren't. And right, we see this challenge, we see this notion of fighting back against the social norm, going back to that. So that's why, and at this point I kind of already alluded to it, but then how does these highlights of Reformation talk about this, right? And what do we see from this? What do we see that it's not just a European thing? This type of thinking is going on all around the world. We're all in nature similar to one another, so it's bound to happen, right? If you're being oppressed, you're bound to rebel, right? again, going back to that Marxist idea. So sorry if you oppose Marxism, sociologist, again, that's what I'm comfortable with, so I know that the most. So right, you rebel the oppression, right? You fight back. Well, what about my beliefs? What about what I want to believe? What about challenging? I'm being more educated. I can see more. I can think more rationally. I can analyze these type of things. I can be like, okay, wait, now that's not what I believe, but I kind of agree with it in a similar stance, but maybe from this perspective, or maybe from this perspective. That's why when I always talk about analysis, excuse me, it's all about perception. It's all about how you perceive things. And that's what's going on in this time as more education and more access to media is happening. We're seeing people coming up with these new ideas. So that is the point I want to stress the most. And when you think about sort of reformation and these type of things, connected to enlightenment thinking, right? These two are combined, and we can see that it causes conflict, but it also causes harmony. We see the balance, we see the equilibrium. There's so many different things that can come through contesting ideas, right? Again, there's good and there's bad consequences to it. Okay, so now the new world, right? So now I'm shifting focus sort of to Spain for a moment. Just shift this back over here. Um, if I can stop fast forwarding. So again, we talked about the Incas a little bit. I'm not going to focus too much on them. Again, in your notes, if you want to look at specific details, the main takeaways I have from them, think about they're a civilized nation and they were expanding and they had similar beliefs and ideologies to that of the Spanish. We say a lot of the Latin American countries and South American countries have similar hierarchies and similar societies to that of Spanish, like the Spanish society and things like that. Hence why when Spain arrived in here, they were able to sort of incorporate themselves into the society so well because they see the familiarity with one another. So again, if you want to go more on the Incas, you can go there. But a big thing is the thing about the region they had and how they had a lot of access to wealth. Again, Spanish saw wealth. They were like, that's mine. I want it. I'm taking it all. Think about that. Think of the Inquisition. Think about the gains they can get from them and how that can sort of help in a broader sense of the global economy, right? Again, I'm alluding to something I will talk about later, but that's one way you can relate that to that. And so connect the connections, how there's resources and you can get exploited, right? You can exploit it and get labor from it and all these different ideas. Right. So now going towards Central Mexico, Latin America, the Aztecs, where we go here. Again, Spanish weren't there to end native culture. They were there to sort of exploit them for the resources. If that's the main thing, they saw new opportunities for wealth. So it was easy for them to integrate. And then when we talked about sort of the Aztecs and how that conflict with the Spanish, again, we know how that goes. But the main thing to focus on that with is the Spanish couldn't do it alone. Spanish were weak, right? Though, I can go more in depth on this. Like the Spanish were deemed sort of like godly at first, right? From Montezuma and all these other people, because the the Aztecs and them didn't know who they were. They just saw, new people coming from this thing. So they thought it was, oh, it's these gods that we once believed are coming back. That's not the case. They found out they're not gods, right? And so it's like, well, let's interact with them. And then we realize, oh, they're weak. We got this. But then Spain wants power. Spain wants wealth. They see sort of um, the value of this land and these colonies and like the potential of having these colonies, right? So they allied with Tlaxcala and the other Nahuas who opposed the Aztecs in the Triple Alliance. Soon, some people in the Triple Alliance joined and formed an ally with the Spanish to fight against the Mexica and the Aztecs. Of course, Spanish won because of the native allies and then also disease. That's a major factor, right? You can kill off a bunch of natives, plus you have these allies, you can fight back. You can't really fight back, I mean, sorry. And so it's easy. It's easy dub for them. And then, they saw the value in the natural resource, especially silver. Silver was crucial for them because of its global importance, especially in China, right? We see how much China valued silver. Again, alluding to another point I will talk about later, but that's one thing to keep. Like these resources are good for global trade because we're starting to see a shift in the sort of the global economy. Again, that doesn't happen until a little bit later, toward the 17th century, a little bit, and this is more around the 16th century, 15th century. So, but it's starting to shift. We started seeing globalization become a major factor, and trading between everyone, all these different countries we talked about with the Silk Road and other in the previous quiz, right? So globalization is becoming a more prominent thing, right? How do you get more resources? Trade, 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 trade. Um, so yeah. So and then meme over here. Okay, so we also talked about sort of gender in Spanish society. Women were viewed as inferior, but though there's instances where they can gain the same value as men, right? The same level as men, right? The queen, we mentioned, we talked about how like they had the queen, Queen Elizabeth or Queen Isabella, of Catalina or yeah, Catalan, right? No, Catalan, yeah. Hold up, sorry, let me double check this real quick. Um, yeah, Isabella. Okay, I'm having a complete brain fart right here. I'm so sorry. Castillo, Castillo. Yep, that's what it is. Isabella of Castillo, and then of course Ferdinand of Aragon. Sorry, brain fart. Right, and then we see market women in sort of the colonies, things like that. Loopholes, we've talked about that with De Rosso, Donna Maria, right? Cortez's translator. Sort of all these notions are to pushing the envelope, right? Something that Professor Alves discussed in great detail, right? So they're changing this notion of sort of Mariamismo and machismo, right? It's like, well, can we get this equal, right? We see that Spanish is a patriarchal society. We see that Spanish is men first, women last, but there's ways to go about that. Though, of course, we see, the negatives to this patriarchy, right? We see abuse, we see exploitation, rape, multiple wives, right? Men had more liberties than women, but also in the colonies, there's not a lot of Spanish women in society, so you have to have these intermarriages. But then, of course, Spanish were able to, abuse them and do all these different things to them, right? So we see that gender is really complicated at this time, especially in these different societies, because at one point it's viewed in a patriarchal sense, right? You have Spanish men at the top and they have these powers, and but also you have these instances where women are seeping through the cracks and they're having some importance and some value, and they're challenging this notion of the patriarchy, and it's slowly sleeping in there, right? So that's something to focus on as well, right? You see how women are pushing this envelope, focus on that. You see that, that notion of like, all right, I'm contesting, going back to enlightenment thinking, right? And women are also like, okay, well, you guys, especially like Mary Wolfenstock or Wolfenscraft, right? The big feminist thinker we talked about in enlightenment thinking. I can't remember her name off the top of my head because that's again in my next part, so I really haven't been looking on that too much for this session. But you know how she was talking about, she challenged John Locke's idea of life, liberty, and property, right? And she was like, why can't women have this, right? That notion again is later, but we're seeing that idea of contesting the patriarchy throughout these different societies. That goes back to my earlier point that I made, that even though they're different and there's like all these societies are different and spread apart, there's certain values that remain the same in each society, right? Fighting back against this oppression and fighting back against these different different social norms that comes from this new found thinking, this new enlightenment thinking. They're getting more education, they're getting more access to media, more access to books through the printing press, all these different things that just highlights the importance of education. And I think that's crucial as well to think, not only for Reformation and Enlightenment thinking, but also contesting social norms, right? Again, social norm can mean so many different things, and that's why it's so fascinating to me, at least, because there's so many different components. But in this instance, we can see it in so many different components as well, right? They're challenging in every aspect. It's not just religion, it's society, it's patriarchy, it's religion, it's all these different things. And that's what you need to think about, and sort of understand that there's conflict everywhere, right? Okay. So continuing, right? Where we see sort of women have power, right? Of course, the covenant, right? Again, ties back to this idea of how powerful was religion at this time, especially in Spanish society. Going back to what we talked about with Antonio de Araso, right? They were tolerant to her being a transgender man because she stayed true to her beliefs and her faith. Again, why, right? Did they value religion more? Again, contesting these norms. The Siete Partidas, right? Sort of this Spanish or this Castilian law that said fathers had power over daughters until they became 25. Again, talking about the patriarchy, right? A woman or women at this time had to be under the rule of a man. Why, right? They see, then you get loopholes, the power of a widow. We talked about how widows had so much power after they gained, wealth and things like that. You can go more into detail, but that's just one loophole that's with the other loopholes, right? This notion of witchcraft we talked about, that was huge in within women's, like the women's society or women during this society, and how they didn't burn them at the stake. They were tolerant to them because they, saw them as the devil, but the devil didn't have that much power, right? But they, of course, opposed it, right? So why did they oppose it? But again, conflict, right? The rebelling of women, the market women. If we're switching back to the colonies, we saw a lot of rebellion happen in these colonies, starting with women, right? These market women's going up and contesting these powers. Again, showing these loopholes, showing women pushing this envelope, showing women fighting back against this patriarchy. Conflicts. Major notion of a lot of these different things, right? Well, side note that I think conflict is a huge thing for Enlightenment thinking. And that's all Enlightenment thinking to me is. They're contesting these different ideas, right? They're fighting back. And so we see this throughout each thing. We're seeing contest with these conflicts and being able to contest against it, and the ability to contest against it because you have access to education and you have access to the means. I know I'm sort of beating the bush here, but that's to me this major connection I'm seeing throughout all these different things. I don't know if that person like goes along with Professor Alves's view, but that's one thing you can see with a lot, and it explains a lot of these different things. So just a little side, my little soapbox right there. Right, so we're going to continuity and change in East Asia, right? So we had this brief period where we focused on East Asia, especially China, and those regions to over there with the Ming, the Qing, all those different things. I included this meme down here for it. I saw it, I thought it was funny, but it was meant for the other one, but I didn't have space for it, so I put it on here. So it kind of has to do with this side. So if you're like, you're talking about China, but yet there's something about Spanish, that's why. But yeah, so we talked about sort of Neo-Confucianism and scholar bureaucrats. Again, you can go back through your notes, focus more on the details of that. Main thing to take away from that is sort of meritocracy, and they had unity because of service and not religion, something that was not really thought of in Europe at the time. Europe thought you need unity with religion, right? But then at the time during Europe, you see this conflict, right? And they're like, how can we be like the Chinese and all these other people where they have unity? What are they doing different than us? It's because they're not focused on religion. They're focused on this idea of, having service. You need meritocracy. You need sort of structure, right? You can't structure everything off religion because other people are not going to agree with one thing, right? Whereas you agree on service, everyone can agree on that. Again, contesting these notions and showing new influences, and that ties to being enlightened to new ideas, right? The Enlightenment shows connections are everywhere. And then again, a major thing with China, as I alluded, earlier, why do they want silver so bad? That was something they wanted so bad, and major thing that they traded with European powers, mainly the Spanish. That's because a lot of the taxes were paid in silver, right? We see this as implications of a monetary tax. So Chinese citizens had to pay their tax in silver instead of what we've seen as like grain or products or services, things like that. Now it's like you're gonna have to pay up some money, right? I'm gonna need some wealth from you. Again, Spanish equals silver, right? Spanish is the main trader of silver. Why? Because the colonies they had in New Spain funneled all that silver to the Philippines, East Asia. Let's ship all over. We're trading. right? And so also we start to see the global power shift to Europe. Why? It's because the market is changing. It's no longer sort of excuse me, no longer sort of a wait here and we'll let these people come trade with us because we have all these luxury items. Now it's like you have to go out there, you have to start trading, trade networks, trade routes, get access to all that. We see the Dutch capitalize on this drastically, right? They're like, we see this sort of gap in the global economy and like this power vacuum, and they go in there and they take control of it. Later, of course, that's known as the English role. They become the global superpower, right, and sort of economies and things like that. But it's starting to shift to the European powers. It's not no longer Asia being that major trading hub, right? Everyone wants goods from Asia. Now it's like, well, we got plenty of goods over here in Europe and in our colonies. Why do we need to go to Asia? Again, that power starting to shift. All right, now also during this time, we start seeing this notion of women in Asia at the time getting more power. Why? Confucian ideologies, they valued the mother, right? They valued mothers teaching sons, right? And this became a loophole for women during this time. They had to be educated so they can teach their children and their sons so they can grow up and become good Confucian bureaucrats and scholars. And so we saw this was a golden age for women poets, right? Because they have access to education as well through their printing press, and they're able to get more educated and more understanding and more literate, and so they can come up with their own ideas. And they were, of course, highly respected. And this idea of pushing the envelope, right? They were pushing against the patriarchy that we see globally. But now it's like, okay, now women are getting more power in certain instances. They're finding loopholes. They're finding these ways to contest this major ideology of the patriarchy. Again, in your notes, you can focus more on details. I just want to focus on the main ideas and the main focuses and connections. So the forgotten power of the Dutch, right? So as we see, it's kind of all over the place, so sorry about that, but we see sort of the Dutch was under Spanish rule, Charles V, he had all those, he had control over a lot of Western Europe, like the Germanys, and then up into the Denmark, Netherlands, that area, right? He had all that power, the Habsburgs, right? Austria. And so then what we see is sort of cells of Protestantism and Calvinism grew there. And so because they grew there, they started contesting against the Catholic Spanish, right? They started contesting against the major power. Of course, the 80 Years' War broke out. That was the war for Dutch independence, and sort of the major trading hub in Antwerp changed to Amsterdam. That's northern Netherlands, Antwerp's southern, because Spain was still able to keep the southern Spain Catholic, but northern Spain, of course, gained their independence, became Calvinist, or no, Protestant. Count. Okay, I have it on the next slide. Sorry, I have it somewhere. Okay, I guess I don't have it. Okay, you saw a sneak peek. One of those. They became one of those. I think it was, yeah, Calvin. They became one of those. Sorry for the lack. I'm too much information right now. Right. So we see the United Provinces of the Netherlands established. All right, they established a States General, that's sort of a republic, experimenting with these new ideas of government. Right. So this newfound ideas coming from Enlightenment thinking, coming from this newfound thinking, newfound ideology, newfound conflict and contesting the old. Right. So you see this incoming of the new, outcoming of the old. And then, of course, the Bruce early attempts at stocks, right? They moved to Amsterdam. Once they were from Antwerp, they become successful in Amsterdam. They become the joint stock company. Later, the Dutch East India Company. So we see the Dutch are really taking control of the global economy, and they're also establishing themselves as a place of toleration because they're not being intolerant to other religions. Again, I'll get into the idea later, as you saw on the other slides. But the Dutch are experimenting with new ideas. They're experimenting with these Enlightenment thinking and styles of thinking. They're like, well, we don't really care about what you do. We just care about money, right? And so we're going to capitalize on that. You can do whatever you want. We don't care. And so we see that they're challenging the old and bringing in with the new, sort of the conflict and things like that. Again, Dutch rebelled against the Spanish and did so with newfound wealth, right? Because they had the joint stock company, they were able to invest in guns. And so they fought the Portuguese on the coast of Africa, established on their trading hubs that they, the Portuguese on themselves had new wealth that way, had access. They're starting their globalization, right? They're starting to expand and get more influence around the world, but also get more wealth around the world. Start trading in East Asia. They have colonies in Indonesia. That's where they get spices. They're able to trade more, right? You can see they're getting more power globally, and their wealth is global. It's not just, international trading, it's global trading. 1648, recognized as an independent country. The 80 Years' War overlaps with the 30 Years' War. 30 Years' War was sort of this huge European war of Protestants versus Catholics, right? So here's a 30 Years' War. As we can see, a French Prime Minister, Richelieu, that I mentioned earlier, argued that it was the benefit of the state, and he wouldn't put his own beliefs of Catholicism on the state. Right? We see this idea of toleration, and we also see this idea of separation in church and state. Again, this is not what was happening before. So we're seeing these new ideas, right? Does Enlightenment spark this? Is Reformation, sparking this as well? Like these new ideas, this new way of thinking. Again, I'm stressing on this point because this is the major idea you want to be thinking about. We're seeing all these changes in Europe because people are starting to think differently. People are starting getting more access to education, right? Media, things like that. That's what I want to stress so much. And that's why I keep repeating it over and over and over again, because we can see through each point, it's because of this newfound thinking, right? So the Protestant rebellion starts up and sort of his Calvinist or his Catholic, right? Yeah. And yeah, because he's Catholic, right? So yeah, okay, sorry. He's Catholic, right? And so it's like a Protestant rebellion happens. So he's like, no, puts it down, but he lets him stay there. Why does he let him stay there? Because one, they were important to French society because they were wealthy, and you know, wealth means everything. And he was like, let's be tolerant. He has this idea of toleration. Let's be tolerant. Newfound thinking, right? And so his true enemies were the Habsburgs, right? He didn't care about sort of what they believed in. He just wanted to expand to get more new territory. So he didn't care about religion, right? We're seeing this war is not fought because of really religion, but we see it's between two different religions, right? So it's confusing, but it's not because of that religious belief, right? It's because there's different motivations to fight now. Economic gain, right? We see sort of wealth and wanting to obtain wealth become the main motivator of all these countries. As Europe is becoming the global economy, how are you going to get more money, right? It's no longer trading with Asia. We have to find it. We have to go out, right? That also maybe leads to like the colonialism, and later, as we see with in the 1800s. Again, is all this coming from new Enlightenment thinking? That's a question to ask yourself. You're asking, okay, is it because of this? What's the importance of this? Is this challenging this? Ask all those things. Again, if you want more details, look through your notes. I'm not really here to give you details. I'm here to give you more main ideas. It's sort of a recap. So now we're going back to the Dutch, right? So again, the Dutch are tolerant. They are using theological principles to justify their tolerance. Enlightenment thinking, right? You're seeing that they're using new profound ideas. They make a republic. This is the first instance we're seeing this in Europe, right? Sort of having sort of what we would say is sort of a democratic state in a sense, though, of course, the joint stock company still had a lot of power. Sort of, you can argue they're the monarchy in a sense. But we're seeing this change. There's new people believing in these Enlightenment ideas and how structures of government should be and should be created. And in 1688, as I mentioned earlier, James II turned England into Catholic and started like forcing conversion. That started the Glorious Revolution. William Orange goes over to England, and rules after James II is kicked out. Why is that important? Well, we see John Locke go to the Netherlands, and he learns a lot about Dutch culture and this new way of thinking, right? That sparks a lot of this Enlightenment ideas. And we also see William of Orange go to England. So he's bringing over these Dutch ideas that are new and profound. Influence is spreading, right? Influence is going. So going back when we talk about Silk Road, what are some of the benefits to the Silk Road, right? What was it? You get goods. You also get trade of beliefs. You get trade of cultures, ideas, right? We're seeing this. This is the new Silk Road, right? In an instance, we're seeing influence, beliefs, culture, religions, all these things spreading across because of these influences coming from all these different ideas and also becoming such global economic powers, right? You're able to influence so many different parts. And speaking of influence, since right the Dutch are controlling these global trade routes, they get new sources of wealth, but also new accesses to new parts of the world, right? So they bring their notions of toleration to Japan, right? So you see the Portuguese in Japan try to convert the Japanese to Christian. Too many Japanese are becoming Christian. The Tokugawa shogunate wanted to stop the spread of Catholicism and end the rebellion of the Catholics. Portugal gets the boot out of Japan. But the Dutch were able to stay. Why? They didn't force conversion. Dutch were tolerant. They just were there for money. They were there for wealth. They were there to trade. So Japan was like, all right, we'll leave you there. And we see that sort of Japanese understanding of European innovations and new ideas and ways of life came through the Dutch. So they were like, oh, this is Dutch learning because we see it as the Dutch, but in fact, it's European that is being funneled through the Dutch, right? So this is again this idea of being a global power and having these influences and having over the rest of the world. And we can see this one instance in Japan, but also that's another instance we see in with Spain and New Spain, right? And so there's so many different instances we can see here. And so it's like, again, connect all these things together and you can see the importance and highlight of how all these ideas are going with one another. So I hope that helps for this. Again, I apologize for some instances. It's a lot of information I'm trying to remember. And I don't have my notes open with me right now. So I apologize if some things were confusing and if I weren't the best explaining things, but I hope that you guys can understand the main point and the main idea I tried stressing so much on each slide. Again, you'll have these slides. I hope that this will help. And next time will be, I have one of these lecture videos. It will be focused on enlightenment and revolution. I know I talked a lot about enlightenment here, but I didn't give really specifics about enlightenment. I just focused on how that was a main idea connecting a lot of different ideas. So I'll get into the nitty gritty of enlightenment. And then revolution is just a recap of what we've been learning over the past couple of weeks. Hope this helps. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. Let me